So welcome everybody to our dialogue with Louis Hyde and Phillip Lopate. We are going to start with an introduction by A.L. Cohen, who is a second-year nonfiction student. He's going to introduce Louis, and then we'll go into the discussion, but we'll also have a segment for questions and answers. So feel free to put your questions in the chat and I'll read them towards the end of this discussion. Ayel?
Thank you, Anena, and thank you everyone for joining us. In the preface of his most recent book, A Primer for Forgetting, Louis Hyde identifies as a writer who works very slowly and whose fascination may never be exhausted. Such authors, he says, do not simply tell us what they know, they invite us to join them in fronting the necessary limits of our knowing. Though given the fact Hyde is a distinguished poet, essayist, scholar, translator, and cultural critic, who also happens to be a MacArthur Fellow, it's fair to say his limits of knowing are substantially vaster than of the average person. In a body of work compiled of 10 books, 2 editorial volumes, and countless works of translations and essays, Hyde has interrogated the public life of the imagination, brought the past to bear on present matters, and illuminated the role we play in the culture in which we exist. With a BA in sociology from the University of Minnesota and an MA in comparative literature from the University of Iowa, Hyde spent close to 40 years teaching creative writing and American literature at Harvard University and Kenyon College. Hyde's defense and glorification of creativity have been lauded by the likes of Zadie Smith, David Foster Wallace, and Margaret Atwood, to name a few, with the latter coining Hyde's now classic book, The Gift, a masterpiece, saying, "It is the best book I know of for talented but unacknowledged creators." Hyde encourages us to draw from both past and present as we imagine our future creations, and emphasizes how imperative memory and collaboration are for creative and inventive minds. In an interview with Anna Picard in 2012, conducted during a MacDowell residency, the scholar said that part of the project of my book is to make it clear the degree to which any created thing has roots in the commons. Even a genius like Shakespeare relied on books and myth that were available to him from the past. To that end, we are fortunate to have the extensive compilation of literature Hyde has had a hand in, on which we can rely on to recognize the limits of our knowing and subsequently attempt to expand them. Now retired, Hyde lived with his wife, the writer Patricia Vigdeman, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It is my pleasure to introduce to you all Louis Hyde and to turn the evening over to Professor Phillip Lopate, a more than distinguished scholar himself.
Thank you, A.L., for that witty and eloquent introduction. Well, you know, Louis, your book, The Gift, it was such a cult book when I was coming up, and everybody talked about it, everybody read it. It was passed from hand to hand, but it was your first book, right?
It was my first book.
What?
Yes.
So, you know, it's an amazing book, and part of it, that makes it so amazing is the incredible range of insights and sources, really. And to me, you're a special kind of nonfiction writer because you bring in so many more disciplines than the usual nonfiction writer. I mean, it already starts in The Gift, where you've got we've got folklore and fairy tales, and you've got Karl Marx and Whitman and Pound and so on, and usury laws. So, you know, I wonder how you hit upon this idea of everything but the kitchen sink kind of book, and what it says about your temperament.
Well, I mean, first of all, it was my first book, but I also published it when I was quite old. I was almost 40 years old when it got published. So there was a long foreground which was not visible in the book. And I had started out as an undergraduate hoping to be a poet, and eventually did publish a book of poems, but prose, and particularly nonfiction prose, took over. And you know, everybody says this about these books I write, that they range, but my own sense is that they have a core to them. So in that case, I did stumble upon anthropology, which describes gift exchange in tribal and other small communities. And the language of it struck me as being a language about creativity. And I began by thinking I would just write an essay, not a book. But I was just following that thread of what happens if you imagine people exchanging gifts, and if you take this image and work it through creative life, what else do you find? And so all the pieces of the book speak to that, and they are ranging, but they're ranging around a core. I mean, one thing to say, for example, is I did begin with anthropology, where all this work has been done. But because my interest was in literature, I thought I would just read. I went to the library and tried to read all the fairy tales I could find that had gifts in them, because I thought that would be a way to expand the language of what I was doing. And so that's, you know, that's how these books come to be. They also take me a long time to write. So that took 5 years, and I think the Trickster book took 10 years. So it was I was on the wrong path.
Well, the long path, in any case, the long march. But
yeah,
the in the gift there is this kind of posing as two different poles: the gift exchange and the market exchange. When the book begins, it almost seems like they're in opposition, and then when the book ends, you note that you've changed your mind about the market exchange being necessarily the enemy of the gift exchange, or that maybe there's another way for them to live together. Is that your current feeling?
Yeah, yes, it is. I mean, when I began that book, there was a kind of grudging resentment of the fact that I had to earn a living doing something other than writing poetry, because it was clear that if you write poetry, you're not going to pay the rent very well. But you know, to back off and say this a different way, you know, part of the thesis of the book is that there are certain areas of social life which are not well delivered by the market. This is not to say that the market doesn't have its place, but that spiritual life and a lot of healing and a lot of teaching and a lot of pure science and a lot of artistic practice don't fit very well into a simple market economy. And consequently, if you live in a culture that values those things, that culture will slowly develop essentially gift exchange institutions to support it. I mean, in the earlier centuries, it tended to be the monarchy or the church or something. We've developed different kinds of patronage in our society, but so at the end of the day, partly the problem is the first thing is to acknowledge that there's a real distinction here, that if you're having trouble making a living as a poet, it's not your fault. It's that you're doing something that's distinct from the way most people earn a living. But once this distinction is clarified, then the job is to figure out how to find right relationship between the different kinds of economies.
I know that both your parents were scientists, and you began by studying sociology. So do you think some of your fascination with creativity comes about because you had to make a choice and you did not choose science, but chose poetry and chose creativity?
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, when I got to college, I began thinking I would become a scientist, and then I got a D in chemistry, and I decided to. But more to the point, I think what happened for me as an undergraduate was that the poets around, I was at the University of Minnesota, and there was a greater range of emotional life that didn't necessarily miss in my own family, but was attractive to me. And so yeah, I moved toward the humanities. I don't think there's a strong connection between how I turned and my relationship to my family of origin, but there's a slight one.
And also John Berryman was there, right? You studied with John Berryman at the University of Minnesota, which was really something. And I note also from the gift, you wrote about having worked in a hospital in a what they call it, a drunk ward with alcoholics.
Yeah.
And then you wrote that whole essay about Berryman and booze. So how did that factor into everything?
So again, I was at the University of Minnesota, and there were two poets on faculty there, Alan Tate and John Berryman. And then in the neighborhood, James Raggart was around and Robert Bly was around. And I did take classes from John Berryman. And Berryman was, when I knew him, an active alcoholic. And it was distressing to all of us. He was clearly a man suffering and in trouble. But at the time, I did not really understand what I was seeing, though I felt cautious around him. And then some years later, because I couldn't earn a living by my pen, I took a job when I first moved to Boston as the night guy on a detoxification ward. And it was an actually very, very interesting experience. It was a hospital where we tried to help people detoxify from alcohol and then tried to get them interested in Alcoholics Anonymous. And so I learned a lot about alcoholism. And actually, I remember one night I was trying to put a difficult drunk to bed, and I came down the hall finally, and the nurse said to me, you know, don't get upset, Louis. That's just the booze talking. This guy who'd been arguing. I thought, that's interesting. It has a voice. The booze actually talks. And, you know, so as a writer, that image of the booze talking was striking to me. And I began to think that, in fact, some of what you might see in John Berryman's work was connected to a tone of voice that was connected to alcoholism.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I wrote an essay. In a way, it was an essay to clarify my own sense of where I felt I had to draw the line in terms of the mentors that mattered to me. And I had a lot of respect for Berryman, but he was not the teacher I needed.
Mm-hmm. I think he's also an interesting essayist. I don't know if you've ever read his criticism. You must have also. Freedom of the Poet. Quite good, really.
Oh no, he was smart. Yeah, he has a wonderful essay on Anne Frank. He has essays on Shakespeare.
Yes. Yeah. So that must have been a kind of a clarifying experience for you.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. You know, I was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I think that was the best way to enter Cambridge, was at night at the drunk ward. There are other people who come here for higher purposes, but I came to work the night shift.
And I know that you often refer to spirituality. So if it's not too prying, can I ask you what do you have a specific practice that you follow, or kind of spiritual guide?
Well, I'm mostly influenced by the Buddhists, and I'm a kind of lazy Buddhist. I'm not much involved in sitting meditation. I don't know why. I'm a restless guy, but what the Buddhists have to say strikes me as true. So to the degree that I have a spiritual practice, it's rooted in Buddhism. That my new book, A Primer for Forgetting, you know, one of the aphorisms that follows it through the book is a Buddhist teacher named Dogen Zenji. Dogen was a 12th century Japanese monk. And he says, when studying the Buddha way, you're studying the self. And to study the self is to forget the self. And if you could forget the self, then something else happens. And so self-forgetfulness in this Buddhist sense is of interest to me. And so there's much to learn from people like Dogen Zenji.
Do you feel like in your own writing practice that you keep a close rein on the word I, on the first person, and then how much of the self you're going to let through autobiographically?
I have traditionally, I mean, the gift book doesn't really talk about myself much, though I was clearly working through questions for myself. I mean, when I began writing, I did write in the first person, but I began to think that the first person is always there no matter what you write. So you don't need to put it so clearly in front of people. And so it doesn't appear much. I don't appear as a character, except in this last book, in the Primer for Forgetting, I do have several anecdotes that are personal. They're there because, well, for two reasons. In this business of self-forgetting, you know, the easy case to think about why you might need to forget something that happened to you is questions about trauma. The people who've been traumatized need some path to get so that the memory of trauma doesn't dominate their lives. But I think there's a much more subtle kind of self-forgetting that's not about trauma. It's about the personality that you carry around with you all the time. So there's material in my Primer for Forgetting that's about my own, the way my parents wanted me to be in the world, and how one struggles, even if it's a benign way of being in the world, it's still particular and still filters the world in a way that sometimes is not useful.
Since you mentioned that book, your most recent book, do you think you could read some passages from it?
Sure.
And tell us how the book came about. This is the book about forgetting.
Yeah, so I just say a word about what the book is. So years ago, I was teaching a course in cultural memory, which is a fascinating topic, you know, particularly how oral cultures and then writing cultures remember themselves and tell their stories. And there was a remark about oral cultures. A fellow says that an oral culture keeps itself in equilibrium by sloughing off memories which have no present relevance. And I was struck by that, thinking that's the opposite case of a culture trying to remember what needs to be remembered, that there's a usefulness to forgetting. And so the project of this last book was to seek out places where forgetfulness is more useful than remembering. And I kept notebooks for a long, long time, just collecting these things. And so the book ends up as a thought experiment with that as the question, where is forgetfulness more useful? And then I ended up keeping the notebook form. So the book is written episodically. It's many, many short pieces fitted together under several headings. The first section has to do with mythology. And then there's a section more about individual personal self-forgetfulness. Then there's a section about how nations or groups in general think about their past or try to put it behind them. And then there's a section about creative life and spiritual life. So sure, I'll read. Here's one section from the beginning of the book. Writing about the cosmology of the Trobriand Islanders, an anthropologist tells us that the Trobriand universe is a vast disembodied space filled with both minds and energy. Cosmic minds are all-seeing, all-knowing, all-powerful, able to manipulate the energy of the universe toward whatever end they desire. But in spite of, or rather because of, these remarkable endowments, cosmic minds have a problem: cosmic boredom. They have the power to do anything they wish, but because they have no needs, the power has no purpose. They may be all-knowing, but to be all-knowing means there's nothing to think about. So they sit around bored to death, or rather bored to life, because as it happens, they've invented a way to relieve cosmic boredom. and it is to play the amusing game called life. To play, you must be born into a human body. And to be born as such, you must forget the fullness of what you knew and only work with what can be known through the body. A human being is someone who has abandoned the boring surfeit of knowledge so as to come alive. So, this is a typical mythological trope that is found all over the world. And the idea being that the soul was alive before you were born and it knew more than you could possibly know. And somehow to be born is to forget what you knew. And so you can read it literally about literal birth and somehow a literal survival of the soul in life and death. But I also read it as a kind of, the aphorism would be for any new life to begin, the old life has to be forgotten. And so you could speak about the same thing in terms of healing. To come alive again, something needs to be discarded.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems like almost a contradiction in that elsewhere, when you write about the commons and in all your work, or when you talk about Shakespeare, building on Italian dramas and so on, you're always basically saying we need to hold on to the past, we need to build on the past. And now you're saying we need to forget the past, we need to get beyond the past. So do you perceive this as any kind of
No. So one of the assumptions of the book is that every act of memory is also an act of forgetting. And that these two states of the human mind always run together in tandem. And so, yes, we need to remember the past. But when you do that, you're selecting, you're choosing things to remember and thereby discarding things that you're not going to remember. So both are important. Philip, I used your nonfiction teaching book for a long time when I was teaching nonfiction, and you have a wonderful chapter about the contrary spirit. And so my book is a contrarian book. It says, let's try to emphasize forgetfulness, but it doesn't mean that I don't recognize that there are things to remember. One would hope even in being reborn that some fragment of your past wisdom comes with you into the new world.
So this last book is really more aphoristic in its prose, and so how do you account for that movement toward the aphoristic?
Well, first of all, I think my style has always been a little bit aphoristic. Actually, I'll tell you this one story, which is I think it's in the John Berryman essay. I have a remark about irony. And so I'm kind of criticizing an ironic tone in Berryman's poetry. And I say irony is the voice of somebody who's grown used to his cage. I don't remember what. Now, irony is more complicated than this, but I was trying to work my way around John Berryman. In any event, David Foster Wallace read that essay and he liked that line and he put it in one of his essays. And so if you go on the web and you look for what Lewis Hyde's aphorisms are, that's the one that appears because Wallace picked it out. And this always kind of ticked me off because I thought, I have lots of aphorisms in my books. Why does that one have to? So in the new book, I start each section. I went through every section and I thought, I'm going to show you what the aphorisms are. I'm going to pick out 8, 10 aphorisms for every section and put them at the front of the section. And now you'll see that I have an aphoristic style.
Well, an aphoristic style is essentially a wisdom style in a way, You have that beautiful essay about Thoreau and the prophetic voice, and how Thoreau is speaking with a kind of prophetic voice that sometimes is an apocalyptic voice, speaking as a prophet. And I wonder if you ever identify with the prophetic voice yourself, or feel that that's something that you're tending toward.
Well, thank you for mentioning the Thoreau essay. I mean, the prophetic voice, just to define it, it's a voice that tries to speak about things that are true almost no matter what the circumstances are. Things that are true about being a human being and living and dying. And people like Emerson and Thoreau seem to me to try for that high pitch, to speak, to have a wisdom voice. And I think that's what, particularly when I was young, that was what moved me about them. And so yeah, I would be delighted if something in my work speaks at that level as well.
You mentioned Emerson and Thoreau, and I remember having a conversation with an editor, Donovan Hahn, where I admitted that I was an Emersonian, and he said he was a Thoreauvian, you know, as though one were one or the other, you know. And certainly you have given Emerson a few raps on his knuckles at times for his self-reliance essay. But that's not what draws me to Emerson, that essay. It's other essays.
Yeah.
So I take it that you don't necessarily feel you have to choose between the two of them.
No, they're both wonderful.
But you know, the other thing that interests me, and I think may interest some of our students, is how in the books like The Trickster and The Gift, how you incorporate so much research into your own prose style. How do you hold on to a voice while bringing in so many other voices? It's a technical question, actually.
Yeah, I think it takes hard work. That's what it is. You know, in a way, because I started out writing poetry, that had a great influence on my prose. That I attend to my prose the way one attends to poems. I read everything I write aloud. I write it 2 or 3 times. And I also have a sense that there's an audience out there that is trying to read what's accessible and inviting. So, but beyond that, you sit at the desk as much as you can and work on it.
You have to internalize it and make it your own somehow. All these other voices.
Yeah. In fact, making it your own is, and partly it's a matter of style. That you have to think, how would I speak this? You know, something that strikes me as interesting in a work of science, for example, I have to translate it into my own voice. So a lot of I think a lot of what I'm doing is a kind of translation.
And you also did translation. You translated from Spanish poets?
Yes, I did. I translated Vicente Alexandre, who was a Spaniard who won the Nobel Prize in 1977, I think. And I've translated Pablo Neruda. Yeah.
Another prophetic voice. Okay, could you talk a little bit about the Trickster Book? Because it moves so interestingly, and from folk tales to John Cage and Marcel Duchamp, and Picasso and Ginsberg, and so on. What's the core idea in that one?
So, so this is a book about a mythology of characters who get called tricksters, and the trickster, simply put, is a character mythologically who's a boundary crosser. He's a sacred boundary crosser. So all cultures have boundaries, both insiders and outsiders, and then internal boundaries about things you do on the weekend and things you do during the week. And the trickster is the character who's there to disrupt them or figure out how to get across, particularly if we really care about the boundary and try to enforce it, the trickster is the character who figures out how to circumvent our defenses. And I take these stories to be about a kind of disruptive imagination. And so the core of the book is to take the mythology of the trickster, using several key texts, particularly what's called the Homeric hymn to Hermes, a story in which Hermes is a boundary crosser. And then my argument is not that individual human beings are tricksters. They are not. Or if somebody thinks he is, you should be careful. But that the trickster story is a useful tool to illuminate how certain people work. And so for one example is the tricksters are notoriously shameless. And so all cultures have shame barriers, shame boundaries. And if you're well brought up, you should not do things that will bring shame upon you. And then, of course, there are creative artists who question that. You mentioned Allen Ginsberg. Ginsberg in the 1950s, there are letters from Ginsberg's father in which it becomes clear that Louis Ginsberg thought Allen should be ashamed of being gay. And I think Allen was also potentially ashamed of his mother's mental illness. And part of what makes Ginsberg an interesting poet is his refusal of shame. And but so the characters who appear in the book, have, I think something is illuminated by juxtaposing their process with the trickster stories. One last example is I use Frederick Douglass as the trickster usually plays with the boundary. He doesn't destroy the world, but in the Douglass case, the simple fact of Douglass learning how to read is an example of the boundary crossing, that this was illegal in the slave culture he was born into, and he learns how to read. And then he steals himself from slavery. And his narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass is a tool that he's out to destroy plantation culture with this created act. So much to say about this book, but that's a thumbnail beginning.
So there's shamelessness, and there's also, it seems to me, a reliance on chance as something that that we don't think of as artistic control. That's where Cage comes in, and in a way, that's where Duchamp comes in.
Yeah. The question is, so chance often comes to us as something that's outside of the system. And so we try to avoid it. We try to, buy insurance and make sure that anything that happens by accident will be taken care of. But there is, again, a kind of creative mind which is open to happenstance and welcoming of it, and willing to turn one's attention to something that seems to have been an accident and take it seriously as perhaps something that should be brought into the system. And so Cage is a good example of, working with chance. I actually contrast Cage with Picasso. Picasso also has a sense of the accidental find. The famous case being he sees a rubbish heap that has a bicycle in it with the bicycle seat and the bicycle handlebars, and he recognizes that he can make the head of a bull out of these two things. So that's somebody whose search pattern is open to finding things in the rubbish heap and making something new out of them.
So you said that the trickster is not an individual, but I still have to ask you whether you regard yourself and your work on some level as trickster. I mean, it crosses boundaries.
Well, maybe. I mean, at the beginning of that book, I say I take this thing from I forgot where, but Calvino says he's a Saturn dreaming of Mercury. And I'll leave it up to others to decide, but I'm a little too disciplined to really be a trickster.
Yes. Hardworking and not mercurial.
Yeah.
Except at moments, perhaps. Yeah. But I do think you're trying to, I don't want to say knock down barriers, but, certainly even by bringing in visual arts and literature, and oral culture, let's say, you're trying to basically extend the boundaries of the kind of the discourse that we think of in Western civilization.
I mean, in a way that the contrarian impulse in the new book, everybody feels that memory is so important, and it is important, and that cultural memory is important. But the boundary crossing is to just say, well, let's think now about the importance of forgetting and add that in. But it's not a deeply tricksterish move.
Yeah, I once read this book called Zakor about Jewish relationship to memory, and again, it's selective memory. It's not to remember everything.
Yeah.
And I think in a way that's the writer's memory. The writer, I have a sister who remembers everything, but she's not a writer. But I only remember things that have an affective charge, that, in a way that I'm meant to remember, so I have a decent memory, but not an amazing memory. So in a way, that's what writers often have, They don't remember everything, but they remember what's useful in a way.
I think the affective charge is an important piece of it, because the implication is that things that don't have that charge are dropped away. And so there's an emotional life that's connected to memory and to forgetting, that many things need to be dropped.
Right. And then when you really get to be old, then I guess you're advanced because you have Alzheimer's. And
yeah, I should say, my book is not the darker thread in that book is some stories about my mother's dementia, and it's not a book in favor of dementia. It's a book,
right.
But I guess it is a book in which trying to think about our attitude toward forgetting. I find all of us find the idea of dementia terrifying, but maybe try to clear some ground around the topic to widen the sense of emotional response.
Do you think of yourself as fitting into some tendency in literature now, or as somebody who is an outsider in a way? Are there writers who you connect with very strongly at the present?
My reading is so I don't quite know how to answer. I have things that get, the way I work is to notice what interests me in something that interests me, which I don't really understand yet, or where there's clearly something to explore. So, for example, what I'm working on now is I'm an amateur butterfly hunter. When I was a kid, I collected butterflies, and I still do that some. And I'm trying to write about what it is, why it is that I go out and walk around in a field with a butterfly net. And as a consequence, what I'm reading is a lot of natural history. And so I love the natural history writers. Like David Quammen has a book about recent understandings in evolutionary science. I just read a book called The Forgotten Pollinators, which is about all the things that pollinate plants. So
Do you go back
read
to
around.
Fabre or insects?
I haven't done Fabre, but I am doing Nabokov and Thoreau. Actually, I'm interested in what Thoreau did not know about butterflies. Um, the simple point being there was no field guide to butterflies until about 1870. So Thoreau knows a tremendous amount about the plants because there were two really wonderful guides to plants by 1850, but there were no. So his butterfly knowledge is very thin.
And how about Nabokov? Do you involve yourself with him?
I do. I have yet to quite figure out my relationship with. The thing that puzzles me about Nabokov is you never get the sense of the pleasures he got out of, except in the chapter in Speak Memory.
Yes.
That he tends to both, he's interested in the science, so that's okay. But then he almost begins to treat butterflies as if they were chess problems. The whole business of mimicry and camouflage. And, that's interesting, but it's now you're on Nabokov's territory. You're in a book about chess problems, not a book about butterflies.
He also makes everything aristocratic that he's attached to.
Yes, he has a touch.
Kind of class interest.
He has a touch of that, yes.
So,
Philip, could we jump to
get some questions?
Yeah, some questions in the chat, then we can get back to you.
Okay, let's get some questions.
Okay, so we have a question from James Livingston, who says, Philip's question about the relation between gifts and market exchange makes me ask it in a different way. The gift changed my life because you redeemed the commodity form as a restless, limitless symbolic property. You spoke there in Emersonian fashion or Whitmanian. Can you speak again to this ambiguity, to this opposition, which is not an opposition?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
Well, one thing I could put you on the spot and ask you. It seemed as though you began writing the gift from a kind of from a socialist perspective, you might say. Did you start out with a kind of a political orientation regarding the market economy?
No, I didn't. The question seems to imply that there's a way in which I redeem the commodity world as well as the gift world, that's an interesting idea. That there is a place for market exchange and for the pleasures of the marketplace and for what the French call sweet commerce. And I think that's true, but it's not the same as a kind of, the highly organized market triumphalism that we now have. Maybe one thing to, again, I'm not quite sure how to answer the question because it would be helpful if we could discuss with the questioner, but I believe that one change in our own lifetime around gifts and support for culture came about with the fall of the Soviet Union. That it turns out in the 1950s and 1960s, American culture was self-conscious about its capitalist side. That the charge from the communist world was that we were just money-grubbing materialists. And as a consequence, there was a kind of reactive support for the arts, that the beginnings of the NEA and the NEH came out of the cultural Cold Wars. And so we began to give money to artists and to humanists. I say this because the attack on the NEA and the NEH began basically at the same time the Soviet Union fell, the Berlin Wall fell, because suddenly we didn't have this oppositional international story, capitalism seemed to have triumphed. And now we were going to see if we could make everything work on a market model. And so funding for the arts and humanities dried up. So, the delights of the marketplace, I enjoy, I enjoy shopping. I enjoy being in foreign countries and going to the markets. But that's different from, for example, making universities operate entirely on a market exchange basis, or making healthcare entirely dependent on markets.
So did you figure out a way that you think artists can survive, can make a living that isn't purely taking their goods to the marketplace?
Well, just to say this briefly, the end of the book, we all know the compromises we make. I mean, first of all, there are some people lucky enough to make a living with their art, and that's great. So you mentioned to me before we started this that you ran into Philip Roth. Great. Philip Roth's novels meant he didn't have to teach. But another way is many of us have two jobs. We do our work writing or painting or whatever, and we also do something else that makes it sure that we can pay the rent. And so for many years I taught and wrote. Some people figure out a way to have a kind of voluntary poverty that doesn't depress or injure them, to find someplace simple to live. And then there are granting institutions. Some of us have been lucky enough to be supported by, to hop from one grant to another or take a year off. But those are the options. We still live in a primarily market economy.
We have two more questions. I'll start with a longer one from Professor Madhu Kaza. Thank you for mentioning Dogen. I'm living at a Zen monastery and reading Thoreau's journals at the moment. Dogen says to forget the self is to be actualized by myriad things. It's a form of forgetting, as I understand it, that allows one to experience the world as new and to experience wonder at the intermingling of beings, to be reborn in an ongoing way. This strikes me as having liberatory possibilities when Dogen expresses it, but from a Western viewpoint, it seems quite dangerous. For among other things, forgetting can be a form of erasure or repression. Is the forgetting you discuss a more personal or ritualized active forgetting after studying the self, forgetting the self and letting go? Or are you thinking of our data mining archive obsessed culture, especially today when it's digitally difficult to forget? Especially today when it's digitally hard to forget.
So thank you. We should have a meal together, you and I, Mr. Questioner. So Dogen figures largely in the book, and one thing to say quickly is, one of the images of forgetting something is to cover it over or bury it. And so I say in the book that there's two different kinds of burial. There's proper burial, in which you want to get rid of something, discard it, but you have funeral rites. You have some way of attending to the thing and paying attention to it, so that it's not repression, it's not erasure, it's that there's a sequence. I mean, the Dogen quote begins, to study the self is to forget the self, but that means you have to first study the self. It's not erasure or repression. Yeah, in the current, well, there's a lot to say about current forgetting, but first of all, I don't think it's dangerous. I think the last section of the book is deeply indebted to Dogen Zenji, and lays out some of the ideas around the spiritual life of forgetfulness. And it's not about repression or erasure. Maybe I'll say one quick thing about, cultures which have suffered some trauma. And the example in the book is South Africa trying to get away from apartheid. And I say there's a sequence of events that have to take place before a culture can free itself from the past. And the first move is to know the truth. And the second is to find some kind of justice. And the third would be maybe reparations for the people who've been hurt. And the fourth would be some kind of apology. And the fifth would be some kind of forgiveness. So that's a long sequence, and it almost never happens. But that would be the kind of thing that a culture needs to do to begin to put the past behind it.
I wanted to jump in and just ask you something about this whole idea of self-forgetting. And when you were teaching at Kenyon, did you, when you were working with undergraduates, many teenagers, they're just trying to cobble together a self at that point. So how did your message of self-forgetting go over to them? Or was it anything that you were trying to get them to do?
No, I was just trying to be a good teacher. But I would say, one of the lines in the book is about self-forgetfulness is you can't forget yourself until you have one. And, so the job for all of us when we're young is to become something, to become somebody. If you're lucky, your parents help you do that. And when you leave home, you have a sense of who you are and you can remember who you are. But this is decades of work, and it's only later. Well, I think at any point it's useful to begin to look at what you think you are, but certainly there's no self-forgetting until there's a self. So one goes back and forth between trying to claim an identity and trying to realize that identity should be something fluid.
And can I ask you what you learned from being a teacher?
What I learned from being a teacher, that would be a whole book in itself. I don't think there's one thing to say. Humility, probably.
I have a question from Diane, who says, one of the things she loved about your work is the way in which you collect stories and examine them like butterflies in a net. And though you may release those butterflies back into the woods, their story stays with you. Are those stories lost when practicing self-forgetfulness?
No, I think they're remembered, but self-forgetfulness, at different phases of your life, there are stories that matter to you, and then later it turns out they don't matter to you. I mean, I went through a long period in my 30s when I was interested in Carl Jung and the Jungian psychology, and I'm not interested in it anymore. So it's not that, all these stories are boats or vehicles that help you read the world and read yourself and carry you forward. And then some of them turn out to have exhausted their usefulness and you leave them behind. So I do like the idea that you catch the butterfly and you release it again, which is what I now do. Yes.
Did you ever pinion them or keep them in some
Yes,
way?
I did. When I was young, I used to collect. And in fact, I gave my collection to Kenyon College. So if you're ever in Gambier, Ohio, you can go to the nature center and you can see my collection of butterflies.
Any other questions?
Yeah, yes, from Gordon Slater, who says, you have a line from your wonderful essay on Rilke, and quotes, all art requires effort, but effort alone does not make the work, and distractions are therefore useful. Has your writing or scholarship changed following your retirement from teaching? How do you balance the nourishment and sustenance that comes from, for example, a love, a relationship, a friendship, and the solitude that writing demands?
So, I don't think my process has changed much since I retired. Because again, I used to teach half-time, which meant that I always had a lot of time to work, the same kind of time that I now have. As for the balance between solitude and community, it's not that hard to find. What's useful is to have some way to have solitude. I mean, my bottom line for what I need in order to write is what I call enclosure and time. And by enclosure, I just mean some way to step aside from everything else that might distract you and pay attention to the work. And so different people will have different ways of doing this, but I have a study, I'm sitting in my study right now. You go in and you close the door and you turn off the telephone and you spend however many hours a day you can stand at work. But you go back and forth between that and community. I'm a board member of the MacDowell residencies in New Hampshire, and being at the MacDowell colony is one of the wonderful ways to balance community and solitude. That if you're lucky enough to be accepted as a fellow at MacDowell, they give you a little cabin in the woods and you can be all alone all day long. But then in the evening, you eat dinner with friends and listen to other people read and talk about their work. And you need to go back and forth between community and solitude.
I have a question. It seems like your books are the product of you're posing a question, like The Gift or Trickster or Forgetting. So do you ever, how do you come upon the theme that you're going, or the question that you're going to spend years looking at? And have you ever come up with a question that didn't lead to a book, that led to a dead end?
Well, currently I'm wondering if my butterfly project will be a dead end, because I haven't found some key piece of it yet, and maybe it doesn't exist. As for the question, I mean, the gift book, it was obvious to me that I was trying to figure this out for myself. I thought I wanted to spend my life as an artist, and I thought it was a problem. And so there was an emotional load behind the research. It wasn't just a topic. There's a question about fascination. I mean, the things I've been writing about are things that fascinate me. And what makes something fascinating, I'm not quite sure how you decide that. I mean, in the case of the new book on memory and forgetting, memory is how we know about time. And time is, what is time? I mean, it's mysterious to be a creature who is a temporal being. And so just to meditate on the mental faculties by which we are aware of our temporality, I find it fascinating. And so it sustains me, partly because I think at the end, there isn't a clear answer. There's a territory to be explored. And the same, this thing about butterflies, what I'm really interested in is there's a mental state that I fall into when I'm out looking for something in nature. That's a kind of undifferentiated awareness that I find quite delicious. And I'm trying to write about it, but as yet I don't quite know how to embody this in an essay or a book.
Well, you've been very generous, and I think that we are running out of time. We have kept you for an hour, and Anena, are there any other questions? Otherwise, I'm going to release him like a butterfly to his own work.
No, there are no more questions. There were some comments, but just appreciation. So
why don't I read one little piece from my book?
Absolutely.
And we'll go. So
sure.
In a dream, I have forgotten to write my term paper. I am in a seminar led by famous Professor C, and I suddenly realize that it is the end of the semester and I have done absolutely nothing about the paper. I wake in the usual panic. We've all had this dream. Reflecting on the dream of forgetting, I decide to honor the forgetful me. There must be a good reason he has not written that paper. He seems trapped under false obligation, able neither to do the work nor to deny it. I myself am now teaching a class. The semester is beginning when I have this dream, and now I feel sympathy for my students. Years from now, will I appear in their dreams, expecting the unfinished work? I revise my syllabus, removing 3 of the assignments.
That is absolutely lovely. Thank you so much, Louis.
All right, thank you. Lovely to do this.
Yes.
Bye-bye.